Welcome to the Week 8 lecture for Law and Bioethics, which is going to focus on public health ethics and the law. It is impossible to cover such a broad topic in one course, let alone one session. So I just chose a couple of topics that I think are of interest that sort of represent iconic moments in the public health and law field. And I'll talk a bit about the supplementation of resources, and then together talk about vaccination and quarantine. Public health measures in the 19th and early 20th centuries had largely focused on removing toxins or dangerous substances like sewage from the water supply. But in the 1940s, a dentist named Henry Trenley Dean, working for the federal government, began to explore the issue of fluorosis and the concern that too much fluoride in the water could lead to cosmetic problems with teeth. He initially was charged with removing fluoride from water where it naturally occurred, but over time began to believe that fluoride actually reduced the likelihood of caries, and that led to a large-scale study in which fluoride was added to the water supply in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1945, using Muskegon, Michigan as a control where there was no water, and measuring a significant decline in cavities, particularly among children. The result was that fluoridation of water became U.S. Public Health Service policy in 1951. And you get a sense on the right of the percentage of American cities or communities that now have fluoridated water, much more common in the South and Midwest, much less common in the Far West. It's regulated occasionally at the state level, like in California, but overwhelmingly at the local level. And a number of communities historically have resisted, most notably Portland, Oregon, which has had multiple referenda on the subject. Not everyone was pleased with the notion of adding fluoride to the water. Initial opposition came from the far right, groups like the John Birch Society in the 1950s that viewed fluoride in the water as part of a communist conspiracy. They viewed the other legs of this conspiracy as the polio vaccine and mental health, and yet court challenges consistently failed. So in the most well-known of them, Dowell versus City of Oklahoma, City of Tulsa was an Oklahoma case where the courts compared adding fluoride to the water to vaccination and upheld it. This is very different from the approach in other countries. For example, in the Netherlands, in the 1990s, courts struck down the fluoridation program for the entire country, arguing that while supplementation might be permissible under some circumstances, it could only be done where actual human safety was concerned, and that having strong teeth did not justify the intervention and imposition on civil liberties. So while saving lives might be acceptable, saving teeth was not. The success of fluoride programs has raised the possibility of adding other supplements to the water supply, and I'll only mention one. So lithium has been shown in now more than a dozen epidemiological studies to be correlated with lower suicide rates in populations where people exposed to lithium in their adolescence are less likely to kill themselves later in life. What's interesting is lithium occurs naturally in the drinking water in large swaths of the country, about 1/3, and people generally don't know whether they live in an area with lithium or without. It's also worth noting there is a dose response curve, so the more lithium available naturally in the water, the lower the suicide rate. And I should add, by the way, these are parts per million. These are not therapeutic doses of lithium. It's more like taking one of those pills shown in the picture and dropping it in a swimming pool. So the ethical issues that arise are, one, whether it is ethical to add lithium to the drinking water, and secondly, whether if that were not permissible, whether it would be ethical to shift water from one aqueduct to another so that people would acquire naturally occurring drinking water with lithium in it. I will add, by the way, that the overwhelming majority of Americans have no idea whether there is naturally occurring lithium in the drinking water that they drink every day, nor is there any way for them to know without extensive research, because this is not publicly available data. I now want to shift gears a bit and talk a bit about vaccination, which has been in the news substantially. And I want to mention, because it's important to remember when you think about vaccination, that before vaccination, disease and death from infectious disease was once the norm. This gives you an example on the slide of various famous people who died of infectious diseases over the years. Stephen Douglas, you may remember from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, would not have survived his presidency. He died of typhoid shortly after Lincoln's inauguration. John Roebling died of tetanus, now easily preventable. Most interestingly, Jonathan Edwards, the Protestant divine, died after smallpox inoculation, because inoculation, that we'll talk about in a few minutes, back then was in itself a dangerous process. And you want to ask yourself, how much risk would you impose upon people in order to give them immunity? And it's important not to forget the disability caused by infection. For example, the actress Jean Tierney had a daughter with rubella, likely after an infected fan broke a quarantine. There is speculation that Queen Elizabeth I painted her face white to cover smallpox scars. I will not belabor it here, but Franklin Roosevelt either suffered from polio or another viral syndrome that left him paralyzed. For what it's worth, one of my favorite odd historical stories, Supreme Court Justice William Douglas claimed to have suffered from polio, but he was probably intentionally deceiving the public for sympathy. He actually likely suffered from intestinal colic. A little bit of history for context. You probably have been reading over the course of COVID about various plagues, but a few disturbing reminders of the past. This is the plague of Galen. It's worth noting that in ancient times, when there was a plague, physicians often hid. The goal was to avoid getting sick oneself, not to treat the poor or the public. And this, the plague of Justinian in the early first millennia. Um, it's worth noting that Benjamin Rush, who many of you may have heard of, who the medical center in Chicago was named after, one of the fathers of American medicine and psychiatry, gained his fame during the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia because, unlike all the other doctors, he didn't leave the city, but actually attempted to treat people. Granted, he treated them with bloodletting and leeches and probably didn't help them, but at least he stayed on site and tried. And of course, you all know the so-called Black Death, which killed about a third of the world's population. It's also worth noting that even in the early plagues, we have confirming data that there were significant class differences in who was affected. So, for example, the diary of Samuel Pepys, who you may also remember from the diary recording the famous Fire of London, describes the 100,000 people killed in London during the Great Plague of 1665 to 66, about a quarter of London's population, and they were primarily poor. And this was very much an American phenomenon too, well into the 19th century. And this graph here, this list gives you some sense of the various epidemics of yellow fever and cholera that affected primarily the South, but as far north as Philadelphia for yellow fever, and then cholera in New York City, which was a significant phenomenon well into the mid-19th century. And in fact, one of the reasons that Greenwich Village has streets named like Bank Street and Commerce Street is because the city moved itself uptown to avoid the epidemic in the 1820s, excuse me. I also show a picture of Betty Davis in the classic movie Jezebel because it is one of the classic films about quarantine and epidemics worth watching, and it deals with a yellow fever epidemic in New Orleans in the late 19th century. And even into the mid-20th century, post-war United States, 1952, there were more than 3,000 deaths from polio. So this is not that far distant. In the 1920s, there were more than 20,000 deaths a year, some years from diphtheria. The primary public health measure for dealing with infection prior to the modern era was quarantine. Quarantine comes from the Italian term for 40 days, which was how long ships used to have to wait in the harbor before the sailors were released during epidemics. And quarantine has been standard in the United States since the Quarantine Act of 1878, a federal law that allowed the government to impose quarantine for a wide range of diseases. And the most notable example in the history of the United States was the creation of leprosariums for leprosy. That's a picture of the one at Carville in Louisiana. It is worth noting that they closed down the last leper colonies, Hansen's disease facilities, probably the more appropriate term, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And in one of the great tragedies, they actually forced the final remaining inhabitants or patients to leave, often against their will. In one of the great human rights abuses of American history that is rarely discussed or documented, during World War I, 18,000 women in the United States were detained without charge, usually on military bases, on suspicion of prostitution in order to keep them from spreading venereal diseases, known as the Charity Girls Quarantine. Though, of course, the most famous victim of quarantine in the United States was Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. She was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever. She also worked as a cook, and everywhere that Mary went, typhoid was sure to follow. She was quarantined against her will on North Brother Island in that house in the East River in New York City from 1907 to 1910, and again from 1915 to 1938. She had done nothing criminal. She simply could not help the fact that wherever she went, she spread typhoid. So the ethical dilemma that we have faced before and we will face again is if an asymptomatic carrier is identified for a potentially fatal disease so contagious that a risk of spread could not be prevented through ordinary protective equipment, would it be ethical to quarantine an individual indefinitely against his or her will? And how contagious would the disease have to be, and how deadly? What if there were a 2% chance of an innocent third party dying each year? We often talk of vaccination, but it's important to remember that the history of vaccination begins with variolation or inoculation, basically taking actual live virus from people who had suffered from it and infecting others with it in a superficial way. And that's a picture on the left of variolation in China, using it through the nose, or on the right under the skin for smallpox. The technique was first brought to the West by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. George Washington did this for his army. It's worth noting that it was not voluntary, it was compulsory, and there was a significant fatality rate. A small but meaningful percentage of people actually died of smallpox as a result of variolation. In an experiment many of you are probably familiar with, though you're not familiar with the source, Benjamin Jesty in 18th century Britain took note of the fact that milkmaids who suffered from cowpox, a fairly mild illness, didn't get smallpox because there was cross-reactivity and immunity. So he took material from milkmaid cowpox scabs and vaccinated others starting in 1870, and these individuals did not get smallpox. For what it's worth, Jobst Bose in Gotingen, Germany, may have done so in the same year. Clearly, it is a powerful lesson for future scientists. Neither of them publicized their efforts. That created an opportunity for Edward Jenner, who treated a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and used material from one of her scabs to infect James Phipps. There's a myth that he used his own son. He actually used the 8-year-old son of his gardener. And 2 months later, Jenner tried to infect the boy with smallpox, but he did not become sick. And we will come back to this case in the last week when we talked about research ethics. It is worth noting that Jenner did a very good job at publicizing his results, which is why he is now remembered as the father of the smallpox vaccine, even though he did not do the original work. One of the only 2 diseases ever completely eradicated from the face of the earth is that of smallpox, with one glaring exception, and that is Ali Mao Malin, who was a Somali cook who had the last naturally occurring case in 1977. It is both ironic and revealing about our public health measures that he died of malaria in 2013. There are at present still 2 samples of smallpox left, one at the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia, and one in a Russian facility in Siberia. And there's a heated ethical debate over whether they should be destroyed. On the one hand, proponents of not destroying the remaining supply feel it might be necessary to build up future immunity in case there were a leak from the other facility or for bioterror purposes and defense, but also the concern that eradicating a species, no matter how toxic, completely from the face of the earth is somehow unethical. This is a course on public health law, not a course on the history of vaccines, so I will not at great length belabor the development of vaccines beyond pointing out that most illnesses don't have a less dangerous form like smallpox and cowpox. So it fell to Louis Pasteur, and the reason he is famous is because of an accident in which one of his lab assistants left out chicken infected with cholera, and the cholera dissipated, and he was able to use attenuated vaccine, and then he eventually developed vaccine on his own, the first one being rabies vaccine that he attenuated with rabbits. I added the slide because this gives you an example of which killed or inactivated vaccines are available in the United States and which live vaccines are available in the United States. There's a lot of mistaken belief about this. You may have seen the case in the news recently in which a woman was told that she should not get the COVID vaccine because it was a live vaccine, which is patently false. She did not get it on the advice of her doctor. She eventually died of COVID. Her family is now suing Kaiser Permanente. How long vaccines last is obviously an important biological public health question, but it also has significant legal implications. As you may remember from the Jacobson case, which is the reading for this week, or which we will explore in a few minutes, Reverend Jacobson had previously been vaccinated. The question was whether or not he needed to be vaccinated again. So one of the questions the law needs to grapple with is, once you've already taken a public health measure, if you still pose some small risk, can we impose further burden upon you? I will take for granted that many of you are familiar with the concept of herd immunity, that when a certain threshold of the population is vaccinated, it protects others. But this raises significant ethical and legal questions. The first ethical question it raises is, clearly, if there is a vaccine that has some risk, and even the safest vaccine in theory might pose some risk, as an individual, you are far better off making sure everybody else gets vaccinated and you don't. Therefore, you get the protection of their immunity without putting yourself at risk in any way. This is a classic dilemma of the commons. The question is whether the law, acknowledging this, should offer special protections to some individuals. Meaning, if you have a good reason not to get vaccinated, we can debate what that good reason might be, and the rest of society can achieve herd immunity without you, is it reasonable to say you don't need to get immunized? And historically, one area this has been true is that of religious exemptions. So it was widely viewed that if a very small number of people object to vaccines for religious reasons, but they don't interfere with societal herd immunity, then it's permissible to let them opt out. On the other hand, if a large enough number of them opt out, which has happened a handful of times, most notably in the Ozarks in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri relating to measles, then they pose a broader health hazard, and then they're denied that exemption. I do want to show you a series of slides that show that vaccines work, not just because I want to persuade you of that, because I imagine most of you believe that, but because this has significant legal implications. If there were less efficacy in vaccines, the state might have less justification for imposing them. In the last slide, you saw the drop-off in smallpox after vaccination. Here you'll see the drop-off in polio, and in diphtheria, which became widely available in the 1940s, and now measles, whooping cough, and tetanus. It's hard to remember. There was a time not that long ago when you stepped on a nail and there was a real chance you would be dead within a week. And mumps, which for what it's worth was the fastest vaccine brought to market in the United States prior to the COVID vaccine. And the hits keep on coming. German measles, with a widespread vaccination program starting in 1969. And now chickenpox. And I imagine most of the individuals in this class, and certainly I, am too old to have gotten the chickenpox vaccine. I actually got chickenpox. But you also want to ask yourself, as diseases become less of a public health threat, and however you want to grade public health threats, I think most of us would agree that chickenpox is less of a public health threat than, let's say, diphtheria or measles. The legal justification for enforcing vaccination or requiring vaccination for schools or for other public engagement probably declines. Vaccines were not regulated at all in the United States until 1902. And it was a particular event. It was the death of a 5-year-old St. Louis girl from tetanus after receiving diphtheria toxin or antitoxin that was developed on the horse in that picture improperly, that led to the Biologics Control Act of 1902. It's worth noting that these laws were highly uncontroversial at the time, and it led the government both to regulate the development of vaccines and, in theory, gave them the authority to remove vaccines from the market. Many of us remember Frances Kelsey Oldham and the famous story of how she kept thalidomide off the American market. There's a parallel story in the same time frame with a much more tragic ending, and that's of Bernice Eddy. She was a researcher who reported concerns that the monkeys that were given the Cutter polio vaccine were showing signs of polio. But unlike Oldham Kelsey, her warnings were ignored. In the 1950s, a result of which 120,000 children received the vaccine, about a third of them developed polio, and 5 to 10 children died. And it takes a lot of time to develop some vaccines, and some vaccines still haven't been developed. For example, there is still no vaccine for the common cold. There is still no vaccine for HIV, though I imagine that will change during the course of our professional careers. And there is a considerable process for testing. And that being said, the Cutter vaccines still enter the market. So while I like to emphasize that vaccines are relatively safe, they are not foolproof, and I'll look at a couple of examples of that in a moment. This is just a slide showing you the sizes of each phases of trials as medications and vaccines are brought to market. By now, you are highly familiar with the different types of COVID vaccines and their different risks. I do like to emphasize it's important to know who paid for them and what the government's relationship with each was. So, for example, the Pfizer vaccine was German funded and was not developed with US government dollars, while the Moderna vaccine was developed in part with government dollars from the United States. And that may give us different rights to each one and may have significant implications for patent protection and our ability to mandate release of the blueprints for the vaccines. And this may be a bit out of date, but this gives you a sense of other vaccines on the market or being developed that were thought to be likely to enter the US market, most of which did not. The ethical dilemma is, can we speed up the process of vaccine development? And the most obvious way to do that are human challenge studies. So the question you're asking is it ethical to ask for volunteers to receive a potential vaccine whose efficacy is unknown and then be infected with COVID? And if so, is it ethical to compensate them, and how much would you offer them? Human challenge vaccines trials are very rare, but they have been used with cholera, with dengue, and with influenza under very tightly controlled conditions. Um, One thing to ask yourself is, are they ethical when the disease is treatable to some degree, and are they ethical when there is no treatment for the disease? And initially, COVID-19 studies were viewed as unethical using a human challenge model, but as interventions improved, at least Great Britain has now approved certain human challenge studies. It has also been proposed that prisoners be recruited for such studies, especially as the rate of infection in prisons was very high early on during the pandemic. And some even offered to reduce the sentences of prisoners in return for participation. And this raises that complex question, not just of the duress in the prisoner model of doing research and them being a vulnerable population, but also, are there some things we'd never do? Would we offer prisoners a shorter sentence in return to having their hand cut off, or sexual assaulters a shorter sentence in return for chemical castration? It may fit into that same set of categories. There are some things that may create a public good or protect the public in some way, but still cross a certain moral line for many of us. It's also worth mentioning antibody-dependent enhancement, which is a phenomenon that occurred with the uh, Dengvaxia vaccine in the Philippines, where vaccination against one strain of dengue fever actually led one to be more vulnerable to other strains of it. In theory, such a phenomenon could occur with the COVID vaccine, though there is no evidence that it occurred yet. I mention this because, as much as I am a big believer in vaccines, you want to both be aware that there have been negative outcomes. The most famous negative outcome, I think, is the narcolepsy epidemic in Sweden, where about epidemic may be an overstatement. About 600 people ended up with narcolepsy as a result of getting vaccinated for flu about 10 years ago. But also that these stories percolate in the media and inform people's attitudes toward vaccination. And if you want to cherry pick your facts, you can find examples of vaccines not working out well, even though the vast majority of them have done so. I am particularly interested in the question of whether or not we need to test vaccines in all subsets of a population before we approve them for those subsets, whether that's a racial subset or an age subset. And particularly, I'm interested in the exclusion of pregnant women from research studies on pharmaceuticals and vaccines, because women who are pregnant, or people who are pregnant, are generally excluded from many studies in which there's any conceivable risk to fetal life, even if the risk of the disease itself to the woman is high. And we should ask, why should they have to wait? Well, the reason in practice they have to wait is not concern over fetal life, because the risks are very low. The concern is optics for the pharmaceutical companies, and the fear that if there is some negative outcome for fetal life, then there will be a public optical backlash. And I've actually encountered studies which are compassionate use and are life-saving, where the pharmaceutical company tried to exclude pregnant women from the study, even though not being allowed to get compassionate use would have led to death of the subject because of the fear of negative outcomes that would lead to negative optics. I apologize, the slide is not updated, but when I wrote it, the question was what would happen when a COVID vaccine became available and who should get it first, whether it was the elderly or vulnerable or frontline workers. But I think these same issues are going to come up again and again with future vaccines and other public health measures. And I talked about this a bit in the resource allocation lecture. We need to figure out as a society, are we treating people who are most vulnerable? Are we treating people who engage in the most socially useful endeavors related to the particular illness at hand? And this, by the way, goes on continuously with vaccines we rarely talk about anymore. For example, who should be vaccinated for Ebola in West Africa or Central Africa? Because the COVID vaccine has proven both safe and efficacious, we've lost the thread of the other element of this conversation, which is what if the safety of the vaccine is uncertain or there is some risk involved in the vaccine? How does that play out in terms of who we give the vaccine to first? Are our guinea pigs going to be clinicians, or are guinea pigs going to be the most vulnerable? That did not come to pass with COVID, but there's no reason to think that won't come to pass with another disease. I will not speak at great length about vaccine opposition now, though I imagine we will talk about it during the Zoom session. But I will mention is that we want to think of two very different questions: whether vaccines work and whether they should be required, because these are distinct questions. You might believe that vaccines work, but they're still an infringement upon liberty. You should think to the discussion we are going to have next week about Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists. And Jehovah's Witnesses turn down blood transfusions. They know they work, but they think they're immoral. Christian Scientists turn down medication, not because they doubt its morality, but because they doubt its efficacy. And does whether one opposes vaccination for moral reasons or for empirical reasons make a difference in how the law should approach your case? Because I've actually interviewed over the years for a study many people who are opposed to vaccination, and this is pre-COVID. And there's not a one-size-fits-all answer to why people oppose vaccination. Some have medical objections. They doubt its efficacy or safety. Some have moral objections. They view it as a violation of their religious or cultural beliefs. Then there are people who have fears of state power and fears of corporate power. And I will add that it's sort of a giant loop in the sense that the people who are most opposed to vaccination in this country are fundamentalist Mormons in Washington County and southern Utah. And they are the far right of the political spectrum, and they fear government intervention. And then there are individuals in the San Juan Islands off Washington State who fear corporate interests and are at the far left of the political spectrum, and they have very similar beliefs, just with different targets. And then finally, there are people who acknowledge that vaccines work and they have no moral objection to them, but they also understand that the vast majority of other people will obtain them, and there is some slight risk, and they want to take advantage of the commons, so to speak. And I will add, as an ethicist, I find this particular small subset of people very problematic because they, in a sense, are freeloading off the rest of us, only with vaccine safety rather than with resources. You probably all know the data on the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and that Andrew Wakefield, who wrote the initial articles on the subject, has lost his license and had his study retracted. What I will mention, though, is the way these issues was presented to the American public led many very reasonably educated, engaged people to walk away with a misunderstanding. And there was a congressman from Indiana, Dan Burton, who had a grandchild with autism, and he had congressional hearings in which he gave equal time to those who believed that vaccines caused autism and those that believed vaccines didn't cause autism, and created the perception of the public as though this were a unsettled scientific question back in the 1990s. You're probably all familiar with the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. It actually does pay out a lot of money. And this is another example of the dilemma of the commons. If you give enough people vaccines, some of them will become sick, though the majority of the warrants are for influenza. And also many people who don't actually become sick as a result of the vaccine will believe they did, and it's often not worth it to the government to fight these suits, particularly if they're low stakes, that create a perception that vaccines are dangerous when they're not. Then there are people who, from their own perspective, have a good reason to not get vaccinated that is internally consistent. They don't doubt the efficacy of vaccines, but they argue that vaccines were derived from aborted fetal cell lines, such as certain doses of the rubella vaccine, um, and that this is fruit of the poisonous tree. In the same way, they would argue that Orthodox Jews might not want to use scientific data derived from Nazi experiments, even if it saved lives, because there are some lines not to cross. These individuals, some of whom are religious Catholics, some of whom are religious Protestants, say that this is a line they don't feel crossing, even if it cost them their lives. This is very different from a safety or efficacy objection. And one might ask, under the Constitution, do they have a liberty interest in stepping back from this? Do they, for example, have an argument under the 14th Amendment, which incorporates the First Amendment's freedom of religion, that while this is a generally acceptable public health measure for ordinary people, because of their religious objection, they should be excluded? And you could think, by analogy to the case we will look at next week, Prince versus Massachusetts. The law has answered this question very definitively in the United States. In the case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which you're all asked to read for this week, Henning Jacobson, during the smallpox epidemic in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1902 is when the actual outbreak occurred, sought not to get vaccinated. He had actually a fairly persuasive argument, which was that he'd been vaccinated before against smallpox while he was in Sweden, as did his son, and they had very negative outcomes. Um, he was fined $5, by the way, for not getting vaccinated, the equivalent of about $150 today. Um, the Supreme Court under Justice Harlan ruled that he could not opt out. You might ask yourself not just whether there was a liberty interest, but even a rational basis interest if he'd already been vaccinated. But that being said, one thing the courts have had to grapple with today is how do you enforce vaccination requirements? If you charged everybody $5 for not getting vaccinated today, that really wouldn't solve your problem. Maybe if you charged them $150, that wouldn't solve your problem. And it raises a dilemma that I like to think of as the jail priest dilemma. Um, this comes out of the idea that we do not require priests to testify to what they learn in the confessional, no matter how much it might help the public. Even if they could prevent a murder, they may choose to do that on their own, but we do not make them testify to what they learn in the confessional. Why? Not because there isn't a compelling ethical reason, not because legally we couldn't do it, and clearly under federal law and state law in New York, we legally could, but because they wouldn't do it. And then we'd end up with a bunch of priests in jail because they weren't willing to testify, and there's simply no public tolerance for that. In the same way, even if we have a legal right to mandate vaccination of everyone, we may not have the political will to do it, and people simply may not accept the optical implications of forcing people to get vaccinated. When it comes to public health measures in the law, I also like to emphasize that requirements in one area can have a significant impact in other areas. So, for example, if you require mandatory vaccination and there's significant resentment or pushback, that may mean people who otherwise would be fairly agreeable to public health restrictions may view this as a slippery slope, get their dander up, refuse to engage in contact tracing, wear masks, or engage in other forms of buy-in. And we spent the last 2 years talking about COVID vaccines, but the flu vaccine has been around a lot longer, about 50 years. And somewhere between 3,000 and 50,000 people die every year of the flu. Obviously, not nearly as many as COVID. But the difference is that we place a lot of emphasis on COVID vaccination, and yet we allow people to not get vaccinated against the flu, including healthcare workers. And in most states, there is no requirement that healthcare workers get vaccinated against the flu. You should ask yourself, should there be? And particularly, should there be during a second crisis like COVID-19? Do the possibility of a synergy between the flu and COVID mean that, while in ordinary times one would not be ethically sound in mandating a flu vaccine, even if one legally could, maybe the increased demand of COVID patients in emergency rooms means you want to keep flu patients out or make sure people know which is which. So you would mandate flu vaccines. And that's why I would like to emphasize public health measures occur in the context of each other rather than simply in isolated vacuums. I hope that was somewhat interesting. It was clearly not exhaustive, and I also realized that there's a wide range of knowledge in the class in terms of medicine. Some of you know a great deal about public health and vaccinations, and others of you, this is a very novel phenomenon. So I hope this struck a balance, but I am glad, obviously, to talk about individual questions during the upcoming Zoom session or via email. Thank you so much.